Stephen Fischler. Um, I live in Seattle, Washington. I'm 76 years old, and I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, which everyone here in Seattle reminds me of when they hear my accent. I grew up first 9 or 10 years of my life. When my parents and I and my sister, we lived in Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. And at the age of, I think in the late 50s, we moved to an apartment in the Sheepshead Bay, Kings Highway area. It was basically a kind of middle class. Bensonhurst was an Italian American neighborhood. Like I was the only Jewish kid on the block. But then when we moved to the second place, which was Nostrand Avenue, it was more of a kind of a working class, middle class area, mostly Jewish, but not entirely. And yeah, that's it was that's the deal. My family, my immediate family, my mother's side were all people involved in the trade union movement. My uncle was the head of organizing for a trade union. My aunt, my mother, and eventually my sister all worked for District 65, which was Distributive Workers of America, which became part of the UAW eventually. And so I had that, strong influence of their kind of trade unionist, leftist, progressive point of view. My father was in a family business, so he was kind of the irresponsible capitalist in the household. Um, but there was no animosity about that. But I did grow up with that whole idea of the union, of workers, of collective action. My uncle was he was at the first, like 1963 Civil Rights March with he knew with Martin Luther King. So I did have a kind of left wing, I guess, orientation from my early childhood. I went to Brooklyn Technical High School. I know Joe Suture, who was my business partner, who you interviewed, also probably told the same story. In fact, I saw some of it, so I know that he did. But Brooklyn Tech was a good school. It was one of the special schools in New York City in the sense that you had to take a competitive exam to get in. On the other hand, it was a school that had 6,000 boys. And so there was a lot of testosterone flying around in the hallways of that school. So in order to keep order, it was somewhat of an authoritarian situation. The head of discipline, a guy by the name of Fanning, I forget what his first name was. Supposedly he was an ex-FBI agent and now working as head of security in this city high school. And 10% of the student body were recruited as kind of like student police officers, and they would line the hallways during class change and things like that. And so you were either part of the 10% that were part of the quote unquote student police force, or you weren't. And I think that the authoritarian nature of that school led to some of us, myself included, to being inspired by kind of anti-authoritarian feelings about reacting to that. So that was sort of perhaps people said, oh, if you're so anti-authoritarian, you're an anarchist. And I kind of like that because it was kind of radical and, it had a real fuck you point of view. Whether I was really knowledgeable at all about what anarchism was really about, I wasn't yet. That happened later. Went to New York University and got involved with helping to create a radical student organization called Transcendental Students, which was explicitly anarchist. all the members of that group. But, it began more of a kind of yippie-esque kind of anarchism, embracing cultural changes, getting stoned, fuck you to authority. We had a flag, which I made basically. It was a black flag and had a red hand with the middle finger sticking up like that. That was the TS flag. So when we would go to demonstrations, we'd be carrying that flag, which did, elicit some good response. But in the group, clearly because we were kind of rebels, and a lot of our activity focused on activity against the war in Vietnam. But there was a sense of being of anarchism and beginning to understand what that was about. And so at the campus of New York University, there were two radical groups that really had most student support. There was TS, our organization, and there was SDS. SDS was more explicitly Marxist-Leninist, really, and TS, well, we shared goals of opposing the authority of the school. One of the, I'm jumping ahead a couple of years, but at one point, I guess the statute of limitations is over. We got involved in destroying the ROTC office on campus. And we did coordinate with SDS on that. I do have one anecdote about the essential difference between anarchism and communism, which I love this story and analogy, but that later on. But I was learning and starting to read about anarchism and talking with the other members of the group, and so it began very yippie-esque. But as the war progressed and as the anti-war movement became more militant, we became more militant too. And at one point, we somehow, the university tried to buy us off. We tried to liberate the NYU they owned a ton of real estate in the village. They owned this cafe called Her Roots, and it wasn't being used. And so our position was, hey, we need a student center, not the one that the university created. We want to liberate Her Roots. So one summer, the university tried, in an attempt to buy us off, they said, okay, we'll give you Her Roots for a year. We'll give you a budget to, put in, soda machines and this and that. And so we said, yeah. We got the coffee shop, and we turned it into a place that was sort of an anti-war center, which the university wasn't happy about. For example, we took some of the budget that NYU gave us, and we bought 75 helmets and gas masks to wear when we went to demonstrations. We organized and rented buses to go down to Washington, D.C. to some of the mobilization rallies and things like that. Eventually, of course, the university stopped supporting us because they realized this is not how they wanted their money spent. And there was, so there was some kind of friction along those lines, which was good. But in terms of the idea of anarchism, one thing that I remember reading at that time, which was very influential, at least for me personally, and I think for many other people, was a leaflet written by Murray Bookchin, right? And, Murray became a prominent anarchist intellectual and writer later on. And Joe and I, we were very friendly with Murray. We used to visit him in Vermont all the time. And at Goddard, where he ran the Institute for Social Ecology during the summer. But he wrote this leaflet called Listen Marxist. And it was like 3 pages. And as I remember, 3 or 4 pages. It was very short. And it was this argument against authoritarianism, and that the traditional left was authoritarian, and ultimately that was not going to be life-enhancing or revolutionary or liberating. And I read it. It was like, wow, this guy's really put his finger on something that was important and relevant. And So that was very good. I mean, later on, getting to know Murray, I'm sure mentioned that to him, but I did read other stuff of his, post-scarcity anarchism and all the other. I won't say Michigas because that sounds too negative, but Murray was a great guy. He intimately interested in what happened in Spain and the whole course of the Spanish Revolution. He wrote a couple of volumes of history of the anarchists in the Spanish Revolution. But in any case, so as part of TS, we get more radical. As I mentioned, there was this effort to destroy the art. We did destroy the RTC office, and a bunch of us got called up on university charges because they thought they knew. All they did, the university, was try to evict or kick out of the school the people who were on the organized committee that negotiated taking over her roots and getting the everything set up for that what became this neighborhood, this anti-war coffee shop. They didn't have any real evidence, so I didn't get evicted, or maybe evicted's not the right word, but I didn't get kicked out of college and stayed with it. We did flaunt it a little bit in the eyes of the university because the very first student film that Joe and I made when we both transferred to the film school at NYU was a dramatized documentary about our group TS called Inciting to Riot. And in the documentary, we recreated planning the destruction of the RTC office and had footage of it. So, it was an intentionally provocative thing to do, and it was a good film, actually. I think we won the National Student Association Film Festival Award that year for the film. But the one example I wanted to give, at least in my personal experience, about like an analogy for the difference between anarchism and Marxist-Leninism during the Cambodia student strike, when the U.S. started openly bombing Cambodia. I mean, that was around the time of Kent State, and all the colleges were in upheaval at the time. Radicals on NYU took over 2 buildings. We, the anarchists, took over Kimball Hall, which had the university printing presses. The SDS-led group took over Courant, which was the math building, and it had a computer in there. And this was very early in the development of computers, so they were huge. There were no hard drives. Everything was on these big reels of tape. That's all the memory and the programs. So the demand was that they were going to blow up the Courant building unless the university provided bail money from one of the Panther 21, which is $100,000. The bail and the Panthers are $100,000 each. So, of course, the university is not going to bail out the Black Panthers. So now the date is approaching. What are they going to do? Are they going to really blow up this building? So we had some meetings. The anarchists met with the anarchists at TS met with the Marxist-Leninists of SDS. We had this, secret meeting. So what are we going to do? They said, well, we're going to have to do it. We have to, we threatened this. We're going to have to carry through on it. So one of the members of our group had worked in the math building, and he said, listen, that's not a necessary thing to do, because you're going to endanger all the people who are sleeping in the building, who are occupying it. And, the building had a whole lot of glass on the exterior. Glass is going to, you could really hurt people. What would be better is, and it isn't even illegal, we go in and demagnetize the reels of tape. We demagnetize one of the reels of tape and we bring it out to them and say, listen, if you don't accede to our demands, every day we're going to delete, we'll demagnetize another reel of tape. this is going to damage the computer more than some attempt to blow it up, which could be unsuccessful. You're not going to hurt anyone, and it isn't even illegal. What are they going to do? But SDS, they had this image, which is also sort of the kind of image that people somewhat mistakenly have about anarchists as being bomb throwers. No, we're going to do this bomb. And I don't know, I guess they didn't really have the technology to develop a very good bomb. They did a bomb, was a gasoline bomb with fuses. Some of the fuses were rags soaked in gasoline. So by the time they lit it, all the demonstrators are leaving. They light the fuse. Before the police can even do anything, the math professors run in and they just cut the fuse and there's no explosion. So this was sort of my example of like thinking creatively versus the very kind of restricted way that the SDS people thought, and they were really in a box about how it has to be a bomb. They were not open to coming up with a more creative way of dealing with the situation. After the other thing, and it precedes this a little bit and happens at the same time, is that Joe and I get involved in filmmaking, and we work on a film called Red Squad, which is probably our first major, if you will. It opened up at the Whitney Museum's New American Filmmaker series in their first year, and it was about the intelligence division of the New York City Police Department. They were always photographing demonstrators and harassing people and intimidating them. So we started to film them, and they started to investigate us. So then we started to film their investigation of us with hidden cameras and things. I mean, we kind of fooled them a little bit for a while. And that, again, was sort of an example of trying to create a more liberated zone within a more authoritarian society. And so that's how we got very politically involved. We got involved with the Panther 21 case and so on and so forth. So we were sort of in that milieu of political action at this point. Now we're talking the early 1970s. And then we got an AFI grant, Joe and I. We were going to do a film about the Francis Tavern block. The Francis Tavern was its whole historic bar and restaurant down on the southern tip of Manhattan. However, before we were going to make the film, some Puerto Rican radical group blew up the Francis Tavern. So now we couldn't do that. So we wrote to AFI, said, listen, we just got the grant. We can't make the film because the place doesn't exist anymore. We had this idea, maybe we'll do a film about anarchism. And they said, look, make whatever film you want. So we started to talk to people like Sam and Esther Dalgoff, on Thorne at the Freiarbeit der Stimme, and different anarchists. And we at one point wanted to make a film about their newspaper, the Freiarbeit der Stimme, the Free Voice of Labor, which at that point was the longest published anarchist and Yiddish newspaper in the United States. And we got to know these people. And so these anarchists were, although they were very open-minded and very knowledgeable about reading, Bakunin, Malatesta, and so on and so forth, they always seemed to me a little more Kropotkin-esque. I mean, they believed in mutual aid and in education and that, the importance of talking to people in order to make social change, which was influential for me. I started reading more Kropotkin and rather than Bakunin, or not to say anything bad about Bakunin, but, it kind of broadened my vision of things. And they didn't want to let us film at the newspaper. Why? because members of the board were in the country illegally for like 60 years, and they didn't want them to lose their Social Security. However, then it wasn't economically viable to keep the paper up anymore, and they were going to close the paper. The day before, 2 days before they closed, Arnthorne called, who was the last editor of the paper, and he said, "Listen, guys, they're closing the paper. Tomorrow's the last day. If you want to film, come on down." So the very first day of filming, really, for Film Free Voice of Labor, the Jewish anarchists, was the last day of the newspaper's existence. And, we made the film, and we worked with Paul Avrich, who was the noted historian of American anarchism. And, we got involved in their lives and got to know these people, and they became friends. And we had a brownstone we were renting in Carroll Gardens in Brooklyn, and we'd have like barbecues in the summer, and we'd all get our cars and we'd go pick up. We call them all the old anarchists, and we'd drive them to Brooklyn, and we'd party all day with them, and it was really wonderful. And Joe and I went on to make a film called Anarchism in America. We got an NEH grant for that, ironically, the same organization Trump just destroyed. And again, we got to explore more about anarchism. The film was based on a book by, I think, Daniel DeLeon, that postulated that many of the things that we think about when we think about anarchism is similar to what we think of as Americanism. Distrust of government, independent action, decentralization, so on and so forth, And the film set out to explore that idea, but it also was an attempt to film people and expose the audience to the two strains of anarchism. There's a kind of a nativist version of anarchism in the United States, and the sort of the immigrant, more Emma Goldman anarcho-communist point of view. And we interviewed a lot of amazing people. Carl Hess, who had been Barry Goldwater's speechwriter, who became an anarchist and was kicked out of the Republican Party, and then stopped paying taxes and lived on barter. He worked as a welder. I mean, he was. And we also went to Mexico to interview Molly Steinmer and Senya Fleshin. Molly Steinmer was a contemporary and comrade of Emma Goldman's. Emma writes about her in Living My Life. And they had been deported from the United States to the Soviet Union, then deported from the Soviet Union because they were anarchists. They got out barely with their lives. They wandered through Europe, and the onset of the Second World War, they got arrested and separated, but somehow miraculously reunited. They ended up finding political refuge in Cuernavaca in Mexico. So we went there to film them, and we learned that Senya had worked with Machno, and he even took place in the storming of the Winter Palace. I mean, these were like the last of the real 19th century revolutionaries. And they were, inspirational people. So, and and so now, even currently, we are members of this group called the Sam and Esther and Sam Dalgolf Institute. And, we meet monthly on Zoom and have different speakers, and they're a way to continue to discuss ideas in history and keep stuff alive. Of course, we're all mostly at this point, all the people in the Zoom are altacockers, all older types, but not everybody, so that's sort of the trajectory of my political activism. I have to say that I was still maybe that's a syndicalist nature of the Dalgov Institute, but that whole trade union background of my family was really still really important to me, and I still consider myself an anarchist, but I don't want to be more doctrinaire than that. This to saying what kind. I agree with some things that Chomsky said about you know anarchism being when you have to make a decision, it's kind of an influence. Which decision, which way creates more freedom? That's like a judgment call one would make. And so, that's the deal. I think anarchism is a kind of a philosophy that desires and foresees a society that is not based on authority or coercion, and that those are certainly negative for individuals and for groups in society. And so I agree with that. Ask me to define exactly what an anarchist society is going to look like. I don't know if I really can or want to, because that's something that would have to evolve. I think it's not something that's going to, happen tomorrow. All the old, as we used to call them, the old anarchists would say, it's a matter of education. We have to educate people and open them up to the idea of what freedom really means in every aspect of life. Like a lot of these older anarchists and free voice of labor, they lived in the amalgamated housing projects in Manhattan on 8th Avenue in the 20s. But it was like really, beautiful. They had like there were a bunch of them living in different apartments. They took care of one another. They really put their ideas into practice in their everyday dealings with one another. So, I think that's one of the ideas of anarchism, that it has to be not just on the macro level, but on the micro level too, of how people make decisions in small groups and with individuals, as well as on more societal basis. I think it's more of an influence, and a positive one, in terms of the whole, not to be uh, not to be negative about it, but the whole idea of questioning authority. That's what anarchists do and can do. From the more militant folks who are out there confronting ICE in the streets, to people who are in backyard conversations talking about ideas that are more progressive, more libertarian, more liberating, and oppose hierarchy and authority. The fact that Trump got elected is kind of like, I think, a setback psychologically, at least for me, because like, holy shit, they actually elected this motherfucker. But it is what it is. And actually, some of there was an old Italian anarchist named Brand. That wasn't his real name. He was one of those folks who was in the country illegally. He had been thrown out. In fact, we shot a section for anarchists in America. I'm not quite sure we used it. We went to Ellis Island, right, and we took the tour where they talked, what the wonderful experience. The immigrants came in and they became Americans. He had a wireless mic on and he was talking to us, and we were filming. He had been deported from Ellis Island for being an anarchist. So he eventually, later on, was working on a merchant marine ship. He jumped off the boat and swam to Miami, and was in this country illegally for for the rest of his life, but he survived on Social Security. So he was one of those reasons why we couldn't film earlier. But what he and like what Arn would say, listen, because anarchism took there was a real sort of seemed to be lack of interest. We're talking maybe the late 70s or and then they said, oh, don't worry, those ideas, they live in the human spirit and they're going to come back again. And, sure enough, there's so much more activity and interest in anarchism now than there was 30 or 40 years ago. It was kind of like a cyclical thing. So, that's the hope that the idea of freedom is going to affect people and they're going to think about freedom, in a more creative way.